These are just once again our topical outline. Today we're going to do this whirlwind history of the Hebrew and Jewish people of the Old Testament, and I'll basically cut this off early in the New Testament times, and you see why, because some things really kind of set us up for the New Testament times. Some of you I haven't seen here before. You're wondering, I was asked by one person at least, does it matter if I haven't seen any of these classes yet? Each of these is a topic. And so if you miss one, it'd be nice if I think you would find it informative to make it up by going online or to read the slides when I get them posted. But each of these is a topic. And so you can just enjoy the topic itself, and you're certainly welcome here. Oh. Okay, so 2,000 years in about 50 or 60 minutes. We're going to be on the pre-Christian era, as I said, with Judaism in the Christian era reserved for later. That actually the last class section we're going to talk about what really had to change in the Christian era. And not because of Christians, but because of the circumstances, and we'll of course discuss that. You'll see some of the precursors of it already in these times, having to do with the fall of the temple and the exiles and things like that impacted their faith. Just a warning, the assignment of dates is approximate, sometimes even a bit speculative. Dating is often by comparison of multiple historical events, and they themselves are uncertain. And the reckoning of years is always often cited as in the year of this or that, or like in the sixth year of this king. Well, right away you can move that cursor at least 1 year in each direction, because it's remember ordinal numbers versus cardinal numbers, and so you can move things around. So you'll see though that I will have sometimes right to the year. Why is the engineers in the room will say, wait a minute, you got this year to 4 significant figures and you don't know the exact year, but we kind of know the center point, if you will, around it. And so I'll beg your pardon on that. You won't be able to read this, but if you get online or when I put the slides out, which I will soon, you will get this history, which I pulled from various sources on the web, and it goes all the way back. You really can't trust much of anything certainly before Noah, and even at that is a bit speculative. But you see a lot in here that is so you see, when was the time of the judges? When was the time of various kings and various prophets? When were the various conquests done? So I show this now so you know that you can look for it, and then you can even copy it if you want and read it at your leisure. This part is there's so much here. This is just the part from the age of the patriarchs, that's people like Abraham, through 722 BC, which is basically when Assyria conquers Israel and Judah. And then here, basically, from that point on until the early New Testament times. You see here, you see some various things. One thing I'll point out, you'll see in this, some things, for example, you might see, I think I put it in here, but you might see several different Isaiahs, because there was something that just absolutely doesn't happen today unless you want to go to jail, and that is attributing yourself as someone you're not when you author something. But it was very common in those days to say, I'm Isaiah, even though I wasn't Isaiah, or I'm Daniel, even though I'm not Daniel. And so Daniel actually, that's one case in point. Daniel actually begins back in the time of Babylon, but then the book is actually finished much later during the intertestamental period. The book is finally finished. Well, it's obviously not finished by Daniel. He was long since dead by then. So you will see some things like that where the things are attributed to one person or another, but weren't necessarily authored by that person. How would we know that, by the way, about Daniel? Well, it's written in multiple languages. And scholars can analyze the patterns in the language and say, wait a minute, this was originally written not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic. You can tell by the structure of the language. Well, people didn't speak Aramaic normally during, say, the Babylonian exile that came later, and we'll see that. So this is just really so you can, those of you that really like to go through these kinds of things, can look at all of these and see some of the key dates, if you will. But I will be going through now some of these, really beginning with the age of the patriarchs. That's before the Exodus now. So first of all, God interacted with various persons. It's recorded in the Bible, and if you took any of Pastor Mark's classes or other classes, you know about a lot of these interactions that occurred. Usually was in terms of God calling them or instructing them, not normally in terms of revealing his true nature. It was more like, go do this, like to Abram, go to this land that I will show you. So he packed up and went. So still, what is recorded is that they listened and obeyed, or not. Not everyone obeyed, but yes. And then it was to Moses, and we'll talk about that God most completely reveals himself. And we talked about that last time. Remember where Moses said, "Who should I say you are?" And so God did tell him in very plain terms. The patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that is Israel, he took the name Israel later, are held to be real people. Sometimes you read something that is that far back in time and you say, were these real people? And we accept that, yes, they were real people, and not just some sort of allegories. I don't know what image you have, but the very popular image is that these were single nomadic families, like Abraham. You've seen it in the movies, right? The people come to his tent, and he's just out there in the middle of nowhere in a tent. May have been that, but it's unlikely. They may well have been leaders of clans. And I'll give you one example where you say, wait a minute, this must be so, and that is in Genesis chapter 14. In Genesis chapter 14, Lot requires, I guess we're really supposed to call him Lot, aren't we? But Lot, yeah. Just Hebrew pronunciation, right? It's a long O. But anyway, Abraham goes to rescue, but he doesn't go. He sends his soldiers. Now, this is not some guy and his wife living in a tent. He sends his soldiers to go and rescue. So there you have some evidence to back up this notion that these were clans that moved about in the region. Of course, at this time, there's no nation of Israel. Therefore, there's not a religion of Israel in these times. And I say they're recorded as being monotheistic. Remember, monotheistic is believing in one God. But given their environment, which is polytheistic, all kinds of gods around, were they, and I introduced this term in the first session, monolatrist. Now, that's a fancy word. It just means worshiping one God. So you decide to worship one God. And so I got here, let's consider some biblical biblical references on this, right? I won't read all of these, but look at Joshua 23, verse 16. If you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he enjoined on you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land that he has given to you. And then in 24, chapter 24, verse 14 and on. Now, therefore, revere the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And it goes on. This is, you may recall this famous saying, basically saying, I know not what course others may take, but as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. So, but you see, there is this reference as if there are other gods. Psalm 95 is a little bit more obtuse on this, but it goes, you probably have heard the choir sing something about this. So come, let us sing to the Lord. Let's make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Later on in there, beginning now at verse 3, for the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. So you have this view that's rather different. So basically, there was this notion that, well, we're not sure he is the only God, but he's the one we'll worship. So, and then of course, 1 Kings 18, and I'll refer to this to Elijah a little bit later, but his triumph over the priests of Baal or Baal. In English, we tend to use that long A, but other pronunciations are Baal. So Abraham sent to all the Israelites and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah then came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping with two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. The people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, even I only am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets number 450. And then you recall the miracle at that time. He assembles a pile of wood and puts an offering on top of it, and then he pours water on it. And it ignites, kindles, and he pours more water and more water. And then he challenges the priests of Baal to do the same thing. And of course, nothing. And so there he has proved on Mount Carmel that this is no God, that this Baal is no God. So that there is just the one true God. And belief in other gods creeps in time and time again, maybe even in our own time. But they go on to times of Jeremiah. Jeremiah actually mentions in his prophecy. He laments people going off. And this is a much later time now, at least 500 years later. He laments that they're going off to serve Baal again. So this happens all the time. Well, the revelation to Moses of the Lord, giving the law and fulfilling a destiny. We'll talk about this now. So the founding of Israel. We already introduced the revelation to Moses, and according you may well have heard of Josephus, who was in the 1st century AD, a historian, a Jewish historian, and he mentions in his preface to his book, The Antiquities of the Jews. If you're on do a lot of reading sometimes, start working on that. But he says Moses first had to come to knowledge of the divine nature before he could transmit the law to the people of Israel. So he says he had to really grasp this concept of God before he could bring the law to Israel. Now, here's where we get into some dates. The time of the Exodus is uncertain, but from the Bible, we know it was the 890th year. See, that's that ordinal number again, before the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, which occurred in about 587 BC. So it's likely around 1476. Like I said, here's one of those cases. Don't take it as we know it happened in 1476, but around that, and think of that as kind of the center point. The conquest of Canaan. There again, here's your pronunciation. If we really want to be right about it, it'd be Canaan. But those of you that could only see this for the first session, I talked about the great vowel shift, which was something that happened in the English language, such that the letter we call A took on the different sound, A. And so we adopt it all over the place. Anyway, so the conquest of Canaan, therefore, is about 1416 BC. If you find some other dates written for this, don't worry about it. It's okay. Now, a couple of big words. I gave you one on monolattrist, but here's another one. The relationship among the tribes is described as an amphictyony. Now, there's a word. You won't ever need this word again in your life, but you can throw it out and show how much you really know, because this is where groups are like the Greek city-states, where they are aligned for common defense and in common worship, but otherwise they're separate entities. And they're also a thearchy. Thearchy would be like rule by God. Thea is God, archy, rule. So rule by God, or maybe a theocracy. That's a term you might run into more often. There's a little bit of difference. Don't worry about it. During this time period, the people were leaders, not kings and queens. And this was what they call the time of the judges. The time of the judges, God ruled. And the judges administered God's laws, if you will. So, but the people began agitating for a king. And I confess that for years, as I read about this and so on, I wondered why, as they agitated for a king, why was God so displeased with that? Well, he knew what was going to happen. He knew what had to happen, because they had escaped from Pharaoh, a very strong leader and a monarch. And so they had escaped from that, founded something where God rules. Now they were going to get a king. And in getting a king, what was going to happen? There was going to be oppression. It just had to happen. And God knew it. So he relented. He relented, and then even though he expressed his displeasure successively, Saul, David, and Solomon, and others to follow. The kingdom was united and expanded into one nation, Israel. Saul, even though he was anointed as king, he was bedeviled by many emotional and mental issues. And he came to a sorry end, basically committed suicide, and having lost all his sons. And then David then coalesced and expanded the kingdom. And of course, we know that he wrote so many of the Psalms to God and about God. Then came Solomon. Solomon expanded alliances with surrounding nations. So David and Solomon grew it, and you'll see some maps here in just a moment. He built the first temple. David was not allowed to build a temple because he had shed so much blood in building the nation. Saul did not. Saul worked differently. He formed alliances. Now, there's good and bad things about forming alliances, because anytime you negotiate, you win something and you have to give up something. And so there were bad things that went along with the good. Solomon openly accommodated pagan worship. And this is recorded time and again in the Bible about him and then people that followed. He also sowed the seeds of discord through oppression and use of something called corvée. corvée is actually a French word, but it means basically unpaid servitude, which he inflicted mostly on the northern tribes. So there's a recipe right there for rebellion. So here's a map that you can see how things were divided up. You see in the lower part the kind of not quite orange is Judah. It's a rather large area. Manasseh, north of it, but below the Sea of Galilee. Manasseh had a really big chunk. Naphtali has a region up around the Sea of Galilee, and in the region where Jesus grew up. And you'll see some things later. But this, and so you see how the land was all divided up. By the way, you'll notice there is that light tan area off on the Mediterranean coast to the south and west, Philistia. How often were the Philistines a problem? And you notice you can't see it. You will when you get the actual PDF that I sent. You'll see that there's a town there called Gaza. Does it ring a bell today? Still a problem. Okay, so that was basically the land that the Lord gave to the children of Israel. Now, I shrunk that to put it in perspective with what David and Solomon did, because first of all, so that size is the same size as impose if you were to impose it on the kingdom of David and Solomon. You also see where Saul was. He did conquer some, but not all. Then David greatly expanded it, and Solomon expanded a bit more. That's a green area to the top that he also was able to control. Solomon built the temple, and this is just a depiction of the temple. It's probably one of the better ones I was able to find. There's a cutaway. It shows you what's inside. Why do we know this? Well, the instructions for building the temple were exquisite details. So we know about that. You see that the water area, that was a thing called the sea. And then there's also next to it, there's 5, and then the other side, there's 5 more washing bins, basically, to cleanse things used in the sacrifice. And then you see the external altar of sacrifice off on the side that's also there. So that's something you can according to your interest, you can take a look at even more. But that was basically the Temple of Solomon. Okay. Now that was the high point, really. The high point really was David, because David built the nation, and yet it was pretty stable, if you will. Saul sowed the seeds of instability. So upon his death, Solomon's death in 922, Rehoboam took the throne. He didn't correct Solomon's abuses. He left corvée in place. He and others to follow left the worship of other gods that was left over from the Canaanites in place. But he was not nearly as deft at managing. Solomon could kind of make all things come together, but not Rehoboam nor his successors, most of them. So the kingdom split. And so it was reduced from a major power to 2 second-rate countries. And here you see the lower in that orange kind of color is Judah. That's the southern kingdom. And the green to the north is what's called Israel in the northern kingdom. As for worship, the temple remained the worship center in Jerusalem, in Judah. To establish legitimacy in the north, King Jeroboam, name sounds a lot like Rehoboam, but it's a different guy. He instituted separate practices and temples at Bethel and Dan. At the very top is Dan, and right down near the border with Judah is Bethel. And to the now Jews, people in Judah, this considered idolatrous and apostate. So important was the temple to the religion that to form these other centers of worship was considered an apostasy. Also, many in the north follow some combination of Canaanite, pagan, and here's another word, Yahwist principles. It's just a way to refer to people that followed the Lord. And it's basically an extension of, remember when I added vowels to the tetragrammaton, and we came up with words that looked like Yahweh and so on. So they did a combination of pagan and Yahwist practices. This was the age of Jezebel. Remember Jezebel, if you remember her, and actually Pastor Jerry referred to Jezebel in talking about when he was talking about Revelation, because there is a reference back to Jezebel, who was treacherous and a blatant anti-Yahwist. Also, though, it was the age of Elijah. I mentioned Elijah already. So he was the prophet who exposed Baal as a non-god. Now, the 8th century, BC, 8th century, produced a resurgence in Judah and Israel due primarily to weakening in Syria. So you'll see a lot of this interplay among the rising and falling of various nations. But there was decay in Israel. Remember, the northern kingdom. When I say Israel now, I'm talking about the northern kingdom. In Israel, socially, morally, religiously. Worship was some sort of confusion of pagan and Yahwistic ceremony. So things had really got messed up in the north. In Judah, King Uzziah, and you see his dates there, about 783 to 742 BC, led a big economic and military resurgence. And when you look in his records, you see in the Bible, you see a lot of reference to very educated people and what we now would call engineers that served him in terms of his developing his military might. Unfortunately, he grew proud of his own abilities and to his own destruction. He attempted to usurp the power of the priesthood. Bad idea. And so he usurped that power. He burned incense on the altar. That's just not something he dared to do. So the rest of his life, he lived isolated as a leper. In this age, we enter the age of Isaiah, who in the year of Uzziah's death, he recorded his vision of God upon the throne of glory. And this is one of those of you that either have listened carefully to the choir or sung in it. We sometimes have sung a very powerful piece called "In the Year King Uzziah Died," and it is so powerful about that image, and then Isaiah coming forth, so powerful that we actually have trouble rehearsing it because you get too emotionally involved in the words and the thought. And later on, of course, when we talk about the Messiah, we're going to talk about Isaiah quite a bit. So we're not giving him short shrift. We'll be talking about that in later classes. So then we're on to a series of failed alliances, subjugations, exiles, and more messages of the prophets. In 746, Israel became a disastrous anarchy. Remember, Northern Kingdom is an anarchy, an ascendant of Assyria to the north. And you see up there in purple and green, you see the Assyria, where they came from, and then where they conquered. So they conquered Israel. And in Judah, King Ahaz was attacked by Edomites and Philistines, so he appealed to Assyria for aid. Well, therefore, he became a vassal of Assyria. So thousands were carried off in exile during all this time. Ahaz's successor, Hezekiah. May have heard of Hezekiah. He was fiercely nationalistic and gained more freedom. He made the worship of God, the God of Abraham, into basically a national religion. He held off famously the attack by the Assyrian leader Sennacherib, who returned home and was assassinated by his sons. You don't fail so miserably and live in that world. How many of you have toured Jerusalem? Do you remember? Did you go in Uzziah's tunnel? Yeah, Hezekiah's tunnel. Yeah, that's how he staved off Sennacherib. Was he was able to bring water in during the siege, and finally he outlasted him, which is unusual. Usually, if you're under siege, you're going to die. It's just a matter of time. But he held off. But Sennacherib paid the price of failing. Then Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, gave up the rebellion and made Judah a vassal state of Assyria as well. And Manasseh there's a lot written about him, very, very uncomplimentary to the point of being wicked. So you see a lot of these people is good and not so good in terms of the leadership. So here we are with, once again, now Judah and Israel, the vassal states. In this time period, people began to seriously question whether they could trust God's promise to establish David's throne forever. After all, the foreign states were winning. Their gods must be superior. And I misspelled there. Hopefully you can't see that. Okay, so this famous prophets like Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, they valiantly tried to call Israel back to God. Isaiah in particular held out the vision of God's ultimate power and victory. The heart of his message is that God will triumph, send a Messiah, and establish David's throne forever. So, and by the way, look at the map and you notice that shape. You're going to become used to that shape of the map. I don't know if you've heard of the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent is that region, and nobody wanted much to do with Arabia. The whole desert. They didn't know about oil then. But so you'll see conquest after conquest has that shape to it. But so here we are. Assyria is now descending. Up comes Babylon. Oh, that was just if you want to see a larger area. See Nineveh within that purple region, and all the way down to basically the southern part where of Judah, all part of the Assyrian Empire. Okay, now under Babylon. Then in 626, the Neo-Babylonian Empire became dominant. Another empire up, one down. It's also the time of prophets Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. So prophet after prophet coming through. Jerusalem fell to Nebuchadnezzar in 587, and the Babylonian exile began. Remember that's how we tag that fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. That's how we were able to go back to knowing about when the Exodus took place. A lot of times people think the exile was a depopulation. Not really. What they would really do was they would take the cream of the political, ecclesiastical, intellectual leadership and run them off in exile. That's why they're exiled. If you want to subjugate the people, you take their leaders away. And now you're left with the farmers and basically the day workers and things like that. The total recorded is 4,600, which is probably only counts the adult males, because that's just how they typically counted then. Somewhere in this time frame, we don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. Up till then, it's recorded time and time again that this king or that one had some record with the Ark of the Covenant. We don't know what happened to it, and no, Indiana Jones didn't find it. We still don't know where it is or if it is. There are various theories. One is that the Babylonians carted it off and destroyed it. Another is that some people came up from what's now Ethiopia and took it down. And there's actually a church in Ethiopia. I think it's Ethiopia, not Eritrea, but Ethiopia. There's a church where there's a long history of people being chosen to be guards of the Ark of the Covenant, but you can't go in and look at it. So there's that. There's also one I just read, another theory. And this theory is that they actually protected the Ark underneath the temple, and that it's still there. It's somewhere in a chamber below the Temple Mount. So it's got a mosque sitting on it. But we don't know. But that's I just read that one recently, and who knows? What we do know is no one's found it. Okay. You surely remember the prophet Ezekiel. He wrote from exile. He expounded on how corrupt Judah had become and shared his vision of the mighty God in his flaming chariot. Remember, like the old spiritual about the Ezekiel saw the wheel way up in the middle of the air, and they have the wheeled chariot. Also, his vision of the dry bones, which we as Christians take as being a foreshadowing of the resurrection of Christ and of our resurrection. Okay, but what Ezekiel saw it as is that this was a proclamation that Israel would be resurrected. Israel would be born again, and that flesh would come upon the bones of Israel, and it would come again. So they would come out of utter destruction. Ezekiel also had quite a message. Not that God was a God of wrath, that he was just mad, but he was a God of justice, and that what he was doing with Judah and Israel was giving them their just deserts, if you will. Then, that's not over yet, Cyrus of Media, that is Persia, took Babylon in 539. He was much more friendly to local religions, and so he allowed the rebuilding of the temple in 520, and this begins the periods of prophets like Haggai, Zechariah, Obadiah, and then later Malachi around 470. And then we have a book, Nehemiah, who became the governor of Judah in 445, and Ezra, another book. He described publicly read the law. So people gathered together, and he read the Torah to them, read the law of Moses. We don't know exactly the date at which this happened, but it was between 458 and 398 BC. This represented a return to the practice of the law of Moses. And then he led the reformation of the community around the law. So this is a very important thing to reestablish the Torah, the law. He also, by the way, he not only authored the book of Ezra, but of Nehemiah as well. Nehemiah was busy running things. So what about Israel? It was no longer a nation in any sense of the word. The people of Galilee and Transjordan, so across the across Jordan, aligned themselves with Judah. So they're separated, but they aligned themselves. The people of Samaria, which are in between, the Samaritans, accepted the Pentateuch, the Torah, but they formed their own sect, and they were considered by Judah to be outcasts. And with a little while, you see a map where Samaria lies, and you see why Jesus had so many encounters with Samaritans. During this time, Aramaic became the lingua franca, the common language. So people didn't speak Hebrew to each other. They spoke Aramaic to each other. Okay, so here's a map of the Babylonian Empire. They did take a little bit more out of beyond the Fertile Crescent. I don't know whether that's just the happenstance of their conquests or if there was enough variation in climate. Because yes, climate does change. And so if there was a variation such that it was more attractive, I don't know. But there's the Babylonian Empire. Then here's the Persian Empire. Once again, it's so vast, it's harder to see that area down there. But once again, the Fertile Crescent is evident down around Syria, down into Palestine, so forth. Okay, we're not done yet. Then we come to the subordination to the Greeks and then the Romans. Under Alexander, they conquered Darius, who now was the leader of the Persians in 333. And then after Alexander, the Jews fell under the rule of his successors. They're still basically Greek successors, the Ptolemy and Seleucus, and their successors. Many Jews adopted Hellenistic, that is Greek, beliefs and practices. Some were even embarrassed to carry on Jewish practices. This caused widespread tension among Jews, as you might expect. On the plus side, King Ptolemy in Egypt commissioned a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. So if when you read your Bible, and sometimes you see a reference, oh, it says this in the Septuagint. Well, that was the translation into Greek, and it's called Septuagint from the 70 that he commissioned to do that translation. So that was a good thing. On the other hand, the Lord, our God, came to be worshipped as Zeus. So they were hopelessly confused. There's another thing, and this can tell you something about something that happened. Why in Jesus' time there's so much emphasis on the Sabbath, in that regular observance of the Sabbath had basically fallen away. And so the teachers and leaders had become convinced that if they could just get everyone to obey the Sabbath, the kingdom of Israel would be restored. And think about what Jesus was faced with time and time again. Anything that had to do with the Sabbath, and then the restoration of the kingdom. So you can see why this was so important. Anyway, the whole area was invaded. Jerusalem, the walls of Jerusalem were torn down. In 167, the temple was desecrated. The book of Daniel was completed during this time period. I know some people say, well, does this mean it was not inspired? I say, no, it doesn't mean it at all. What if the Holy Spirit says to someone, I want you to complete the book of Daniel so that people have an example of what faithfulness to God will result in. And to me, that is divine inspiration. That's just my thinking. But it's holding out the hope of the ultimate redemption for the faithful. And Jesus did like to refer to Daniel a fair amount. So it had quite an effect on him. Well, the Jews revolted under Judas Maccabeus, and the temple was rededicated in December 164, or a month of December, and a date commemorated as Hanukkah. And Hanukkah, we call it often the Feast of Lights, but it's really the Feast of Dedication. It's the dedication of the temple as it is rededicated to the worship of God. And this is just a diagram of the Ptolemaic kingdom, and mostly in Egypt, if you will. And then the Seleucid kingdom, and what was conquered finally in that green by the Seleucids. So this is like second, third century BC. Well, we're not done yet. Now it's the subordination to the Greeks and to the Romans. Number two, Roman area is complicated. Few events are noteworthy for the purposes that we have. There were many internal and external struggles. And I say both during the late Greek times and then the Roman times. If you read some of the accounts, the palace intrigue was really something. It would make the Borgias look like saints. There was assassination after assassination after assassination, and I don't know why anyone would want to lead, because you're going to get assassinated. But anyway, by 37 BC, regional control was obtained by Herod the Great, propped up by Roman authority. Another fancy word, it's called suzerainty. Suzerainty means you have a suzerain, that is the high leader, and then there's a vassal leader under him. And that was Herod the Great. So he was the semi-great, because he was propped up by Roman authority. Up through the time of Jesus, Rome had little reason to mess with the religion of the Jews. It didn't bother them. But there were rebellions and insurrections, all recorded in detail by Josephus that I've mentioned earlier. Then, now we're into New Testament times. In 70 AD, at that time, the temple was, as Jesus predicted, completely destroyed. It was leveled to the ground. And for those of us that one of our trips to Israel, those of us, our guide said, the reason it was completely destroyed was that they knew it was coated inside with gold. And so not one stone was left standing. They took all the gold. And so it was left with nothing. And actually, when the Romans tended to do this, if they wanted to obliterate the memory of something, so they obliterated the temple. Later on, they also obliterated the tomb of Christ, leveled it to the ground. So that's why when you go there, you don't see a tomb. You see now something has been built on top of it, and it's just the stone there, leveled to the ground, which is what the Romans did if they wanted to obliterate it. As our guide said, thus they indicated forever where the tomb was, because they put it, leveled it to the ground. Okay, then in 132 to 136, there was a man named Simon Bar Kokhba. He led the third and last major revolt. It was crushed after some initial successes, and so the Romans came in and they depopulated the region. Judea ceased to exist. Rome decided no longer to confer any identity on Judea. From that time forward, it would be referred to as Syria Palestina. It's by Roman intention. That's a geographical designation. It's not an ethnic one. It's not a national one. It is strictly geographical. And so from that Latin term, we get the word Palestine. With the widespread persecutions, and the loss of any national existence, the Jews were scattered, something called a diaspora. They were scattered widely in Asia, Africa, Europe, eventually the US and others. And when we talk about this in the very last class, we'll talk a lot more about this. This circumstances greatly affected Jewish worship. No longer would much of it center on the temple and the rites of the temple. You wouldn't go there on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. You wouldn't go to the temple because it didn't exist. And same way for the sacrifices that would occur. No longer was there any national identity associated with Judaism. So there's no state of Israel until very recently now. So that's where we are. And I hope you can see how the religion kind of changed. It changed in terms of mode of worship. It changed in terms of the expectations of God, that God now would let some things happen, but he would in the end triumph through the coming of the Messiah. And the whole mode of worship would change. So here's just, I promise you some maps. Here's on the left side is a map of Israel and the surrounding region during Jesus' time. The darker brown is the lower part of that is Judea. The upper part that's still brown is Samaria. And above that is Galilee. And so you can see why when Jesus is going back and forth between Jerusalem and its surrounding and Galilee, how he would run into a lot of Samaritans because he was in their country. So it gives you an idea that you see the little lake up there. It's rather big. It's Galilee and the Sea of Galilee or Lake Tiberias. And of course, down below you see the Dead Sea. You also can see the Roman Empire, just in case you're wondering how big did it get. There you see where it got, and all the way up, really, just almost to Scotland, but it didn't quite make it there. So there's your whirlwind history, and I'm out of breath. So anyway, before we do some questions, just to let you know, next time we're going to do a review of the law and its extensions, explanations, talk about the Torah, also the Talmud, the Mishnah, and the Mishnah Torah, how they came into being, why they exist, if you will, because they didn't in, say, early Israel. These were much later, really during what we would call New Testament times and beyond. So it's only a 2-word subject, the law, but it's a big one. So I have talked myself silly. Questions, comments?
John, I've got 3 questions. I'll ask them very quickly because I know we're at the end of the program here. Did you, by any chance, look at the period of the Exodus? Was likely it was 1476. By any chance, look and see what Pharaoh might have fallen over that?
Yeah. That is a subject of endless debate. Some people align the dates differently, and they come up with one of the Ramses. I forget which one. And in fact, that's what Cecil B. DeMille concluded, was it was one of the Ramses. So if you watch his movie about the 10 Commandments, yes. I think it might have been Thutmose III, who did he kill his mother or grandmother? Hatshepsut. Anyway, it seems to be about the right time frame, but I don't know.
Okay.
It's continual debate, and it will continue because we don't have good records that link these things.
Right. Second question I had was, you said that Solomon openly accommodated pagan worship. Can you explain it just a little bit? What did he do? Did he allow temples and stuff to be built?
There were various sites in the Bible. They tend to be called high places. That he left in the high place. It wasn't because they were high. It was because that built on various hills and so on, there would be these worship sites for various Canaanite gods. And so it was those things. And then the Asherah, the female goddess. Yeah. Anyway, there were also various shrines and so forth to her that he left in place. And why? I don't know. Maybe it's because he was kind of an accommodator. You know, he
speculation. Let me digress for a minute. Solomon is said to be the wisest man in the world. He's also known to have 400 wives. I think those two things contradict one another.
Yeah.
But of those 400 wives, many of them were pagans. And so the pagan gods were brought into his household.
Yeah.
Accommodation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's yes. Thank you. I forgot about that fact. So some of it had to do with that he would. I mean, these were wives in some sort of we would recognize as marital sense. It was more alliances. How many of them were dalliances and how many were alliances? I don't know.
One last question. You said that King Ptolemy translated the Jewish scriptures into Septuagint. So the term Jewish scriptures, I have a little bit of confusion on, what was included in that. Is this something that developed and evolved over time? And I know that's a whole discussion.
All right. This was really basically the Tanakh. Now I don't know if he also did some of the Apocrypha. I haven't found any of that in there, but I do know it was the Tanakh, and so what we recognize as the Old Testament.
Basically. We'll talk about that more next time, it looks like.
Yeah, we'll talk about the law, and when I say the law, some of it's going to be talking about the Torah, but because that's where it is embodied, but then it is also expanded upon for daily use, if you will, in the Talmud and other writings. Yes.
So, to culminate this 2,000 years, the Jews are going to a diaspora, and they're here and there throughout the Asia, and it's what 140 AD or something like that. And the common thought of the Jews, since they don't have or national identity, is that God will triumph with the coming of the Messiah. So obviously they rejected Jesus, and now they're on another.
Yes, yeah. By and large, they rejected Jesus as the Messiah, and there are various factors as to how this and why this might occur. There's some of it just has never been explained this way to me, but I do have to wonder about this, and that is they really had the expectation that the Messiah was going to come and reestablish the kingdom as a secular kingdom, in the sense of a nation. That's not what he came to do. He established the kingdom of God, all right, but it was in a different sense, in a much broader sense than what they were thinking. They were thinking to reestablish Israel. So that's one thing. Another is that the early Christians were basically pacifists. And when the Romans came and destroyed the temple, there weren't any Christians that stood up for the Jewish forces. And so
Were they not just pacifist Jews? Or, they may have been Christian, but
no, that the Christians were pacifists. They at that point they did not have a basically an ethic of war or conflict. Yeah, in the church. So they,
coming.
Yeah.
Not true.
So they, as far as then the the devout Jews were concerned, and the nationalistic Jews, is they were let down. They viewed it as being let down by the Christians. So those are my two. But well, the latter one just came from my head. The other about the pacifist Christians is pretty well documented and accepted. Other. By the way, I waited 8 seconds. You know why? Because the most reticent person will wait 8 seconds before asking a question. So I have this, I go ahead and ask for this uncomfortable silence. And there it was. So, well, thank you. Next time we will talk about the law and other things associated with it. In some ways, we're going to bump up against it for several times, because then we're going to talk about sin and redemption and things like that. And then we're going to talk about ethics. You say, well, isn't that somehow contained in sin? I could have collapsed it into one thing, but I didn't. I decided that there was enough to say about the approach to ethical action that we could treat that separately. So in that case, let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this opportunity to be together. We also are well aware that we're entering a time where we celebrate the independence, the freedom that we have in this great nation, and we thank you for your blessing on us in this nation. And we pray your blessing on each of us as we go forward. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.